thank you very much. Very excited to be here, and I wanted to start. Does someone put the presentation up? I wanted to start expressing my gratitude to the organizers of the conference, ATBC and SCB, for allowing me to speak as the first speaker here, as the keynote speaker on this exciting forum on sustainable development. This interaction, this interface of landscapes, people's interactions with these landscapes, businesses, and somehow in there we're trying to achieve these conservation objectives. And as Madhu earlier said, I'm sort of moving there, and I have been for the past 20 odd years in that field where these different forces interact, trying to make sense both from a scientific point of view as well as from a practical point of view of what it actually means. It's all fine as scientists to work on these things and have broad ideas about what we'd like to do, or ideally what timber concession should be doing, or how you design a oil pump concession. It's quite a different question to wonder what it looks like. So I'm going to sort of fly through this thing in the next 45-50 minutes in a very sort of superficial manner, looking at this from above. Where are we at the moment in this integration of conservation and business? What have we achieved? And I used a slightly dramatic subtitle here. Is this actually meaningful? Does it mean anything in terms of the conservation objectives that most of us here in this room would feel very strongly about? Are we achieving what we set ourselves to achieve? Or is this all greenwashing? So many companies, so many industries saying this is what we want to contribute, this is what we're trying in terms of sustainability, but what does it really mean on the ground? So I'm going to run through these examples. And before I start, I wanted to say a little bit more about the organizations I represent. So there's three pillars, main pillars in my work. As Madhu sort of said, I represent an initiative, the Borneo Futures Initiative, which has been running for the past 5 years. Something I started with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Mark Ankanas, who looks at the Malaysian side of Borneo, whereas I am much more focused on the Indonesian side of Borneo. And I guess the thinking came out of our sense of frustration, having worked in Borneo for over 20 years, just seeing things slip away between our fingers, like we've tried, but we can't stabilize the system. What can we really do? And you're working in these projects where you're trying to change things on the ground, but overall, the biggest impact, I've worked a lot on a species like an orangutan, and I've seen them absolutely plummet in those 20 years. I mean, I tend to say I run on a 90, 95 to 98% failure rate in my work. If you really look at what we're achieving, it's really quite sad. So we came out of this with a sense of frustration, saying, let's try to do something different. And we're not doing something spectacularly different, but we just said, let's try to bring the science together for Borneo as much as we can, understand what land use decisions are really about. What is land use management really about? What are the scientific aspects there? And can we somehow describe that scientifically and translate it into information that policymakers and the public can actually use to change mindsets and to change policies, so ultimately we have change on the ground. So that came originally out of the think tank of our main donor from the start, the Arcus Foundation, who basically had the same question. The Arcus Foundation, based in the US and Cambridge in the UK, I think they're one of the largest donors of grade A conservation. They had that same sense of frustration. There's a lot of money going into these projects, but what is it really doing? Is there something bigger here we can do? We can at least try to really change the systems that we're trying to achieve conservation in. So out of that thinking came support initially from the Arcus Foundation, and a whole lot of other organizations have helped us. I ran out of space for logos there, but there's a growing group of people, and we're not actually an organization. Borneo Futures is nothing. It's just a bunch of like-minded people. Anyone in this room can be Borneo Futures today if you want to. It's like-minded people recognizing that there is an increasing large amount of data availability, data available to answer some really meaningful questions about this land in Borneo. Other organizations, UNEP, we've recently started a program with the Darwin Initiative looking at social forestry in Indonesia. The University of Queensland, where I do most of my academic work, DICE in the UK,
'closely together a number of research organizations, etc.
I wanted to start sort of looking at the big picture, and I think the discussion between integration of, or the discussion about the integration of conservation in development, conservation in business, has a lot to do with the quite heated debate in conservation science of this thing called new conservation. And you're probably all aware of the various papers that have been written back and forth, quite angry sometimes, where people that would stand for the new conservation, this recognition that really every square inch of this planet has somehow been influenced by people, and we need to somehow spread our conservation activity across this landscape and the seascapes to really try to influence the way everyone and everywhere deals with land and resources, so we reach targeting conservation outcomes across the entire globe. And as opposed to that, that's new conservation, of course, then there is the old conservation and traditional conservation, which I think focuses much more on species conservation in areas that are set aside for protecting large wildernesses where these species live. So your protected area approach. The two are not mutually exclusive, but the debate is clearly sort of heated enough to generate a lot of steam between people. And I wanted to just highlight it because I think in general there's issues there that touches on this integration of conservation in business. The focus on protected areas is very clear. I mean, we only ever going to protect that much of the world, and I'm primarily talking here about the terrestrial part of the world, not so much on the marine side. But if you're happy at 20%, 30% of the land, I'd love to push for more, but it's always going to be less than the non-protected part of the world. So the choice would be, if you invest all your resources in those protected areas and you walk away from the rest is going to be a very large area, presumably with pretty low conservation values. Two other things, level of funding. I work in Indonesia, where generally the amount of funding available for conservation area management is pretty low. No, actually, the amount of funding made available is pretty good. If you look at the government budgets that are there, the money that's set aside, allocated for conservation and management of protected areas are pretty good. But what actually trickles down to the ground, what is actually being implemented and used for conservation activities like patrolling, law enforcement, that's really quite small. So there is an issue of funding, shortcoming in funding or insufficient funding to really cover all the conservation activities that we would like to cover. And that funding shortage is there as well in the business sector, although it can be very high. I've worked with companies that have allocated significant budgets that are far higher than an average per hectare budget of a national park, even in the United States. So if you get it right, there's potentially a lot of money and a lot of capacity available. And capacity is my next point there, where I think in general there is limited conservation capacity pretty much everywhere. We're all struggling, there's not enough resources, not enough good people to do the work that we need to do, not enough good scientists out there, so there's a real limitation in capacity. And that capacity limitation is also similar in the corporate sector, in the business sector that are trying to do conservation. What I do see is, this may just apply to Indonesia, but there's a very distinctive shift from people that have a conservation background, that have worked for 10, 15, 20, 30 years in an NGO environment. They're all moving across to the corporate sector at the moment. I guess partly because it pays much better. And it's certainly happening. And I haven't quite made in my mind whether that's a good or a bad thing. In the end, we want conservation capacity, whether it sits there or there, might not be that important, but I don't know, because you're clearly also spreading the limited amount of capacity that is there even thinner, and that might be an issue. Now, the final point I wanted to make, of course, if you're focusing your resources on national park or protected area management, and it's a really well managed protected area in a primary rainforest, you can achieve as much as 100% of your conservation targets if you manage it really well. That's never going to happen in a non-conservation, non-protected area. If I work with an old pump concession, if I'm really lucky, they're setting aside 25–30% of their concession, but the main target of that oil pump concession is to produce as much palm oil as possible and generate revenues for their shareholders. That's what companies do. So, yes, you could get up to 50% of the conservation targets if you're very lucky, and depending on the land you're talking about, but it's always going to be less than protected area. So I think sort of generally I've set up the framework for what we're talking about. And I'm going to test that, or I'm going to apply that to Borneo. Now, why Borneo? I guess that's where I've always worked. I came out here in the early 1990s, worked in Java initially, and then moved to Borneo, and that's where I am. I try to do all my work, my scientific work, my consultancy work, my engagement with companies, my media work. I focus it all on one geography at the moment, as much as possible, just to get some coherence in my work and not be pulled all over the place. But it's also obvious that Borneo is a fantastically beautiful island. It's got beautiful forests left. I mean, there tends to be a bit of a doom and gloom about conservation, but yes, I mean, there's some pretty ugly, from a conservation point of view, ugly parts of Borneo, but there's also some pretty stunning parts where you can fly for hours in a small airplane, and it's just vast expanses of rainforest. And in fact, that the Sumatran rhino was recently rediscovered in Borneo. This is an example of how unexplored, how big, and how rich the place is still be, and how little we actually know about it. And it's also super important for biodiversity. It's got very nice species diversity. It's got high levels of endemism. We published a paper, I don't know whether you can read those titles in the back, but we published a paper 2 years ago looking at the evolutionary lineages that sort of come up from plants, from invertebrates, from birds, from mammals, amphibians, and so on. And the hotspots of evolutionary biodiversity in the whole of Southeast Asia are really Borneo #1 and Indochina #2. Pretty much all your species, lineages, somehow originate from those areas. So obviously super important, still a lot of forest, also a lot of rapid change. And rapid change that I'm personally trying to slow down as much as I can, or at least trying to get some sense in the decision making behind that change. So I think there's a lot of bad decision making, uninformed by information that is potentially there. A lot of it selfish, a lot of it through vested interest, but a lot of it also because people simply don't know. I wanted to take a step back. I'm also not repeating my age, but it was a time when we still had hair. And I came out, as I said, as a student in the early 1990s, probably like a lot of you who work in this field. I was focused on ecology. I spent a few years collecting. Every morning I came out on the savannah. It's a beautiful national park in the drier part of East Java. Beautiful, vast expanses of grasslands with herds of banteng and water buffalo and deer and leopards, and really quite rich. And I spent doing my ecological stuff, picking up deer down and putting them somewhere else, looking at decay rates, somehow trying to get some understanding of what this means for our standard methods to count or estimate deer populations. But whilst working in that park, I think it became very quickly clear that the problems that I was looking at as an ecologist, even if they were methodologically and slightly applied, had nothing to do with solving the conservation problems. I mean, the conservation problems were right in front of us. The park was really badly managed. There were massive problems of illegal hunting, illegal logging, bad management of invasive species. The park authorities planted a fire barrier of acacia and nilotica at some stage, and it happens to do extremely well in all the grasslands, so that spread over the years, basically taking out all the grasslands. And I haven't been back for a few years, but the park is pretty much gone. It's still there as a park, but I think the banteng have come down from 300 to 3. The pigs, for some reason, have completely disappeared, and I work a lot on pigs. I know there's a lot of countries that are struggling to get rid of invasive pigs, feral pigs. Somehow in that national park they managed, and I still don't know how. So there's issues there that are not good. So I was waking up to the fact that, yes, conservation area is a term on paper, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's achieving your conservation objectives. I spent a lot of time then working in the Indonesian part of Borneo, Kalimantan, and my task was there to, for the first time, to describe the distribution range of the orangutan and other large mammals. So I spent about 3 years going up and down every river, going into the interior, talking to people, working in different landforms, including logging concessions. And I guess at the time, logging concessions were the great big enemy of conservation. We hated them. They were the destroyers of rainforests. They were the ones that were going in, overlogging forests, creating degraded forests that were susceptible to further illegal logging and fires. They were the ones that everyone was focused on as the great evil in conservation. But I was slightly surprised to find at the time that actually most of my orangutans lived in timber concessions because they covered the large areas, but also orangutans seem to be doing pretty well in this area. So, I won't have a slide jump, but basically I was starting to pick up on these two issues. Conservation areas are not fulfilling the entire thing for us, and timber concessions can play an important role. And subsequent science has clearly shown that indeed a lot of forest is much better than no forest at all. The study here by Luke Gibson et al. Published a few years back in Nature shows that very clearly, where your vertical dashed line is the baseline, basically your primary forest biodiversity, and then a number of different vegetation or land covers, including in the lower left corner your light grey box that shows selectively logged forest is really your second best option. If you're not going to protect it, selectively logging it is giving you the best bang for your buck in terms of what still survives. There's going to be some disturbance, there's going to be some changes, but you do it well, it's a great conservation opportunity. And then after that, pretty much all the other land uses going into more degraded types of forests, into secondary regrowth of forests, into monocultures of either oil palm or pulp and paper species like acacia and albizia and eucalyptus and so on. Then your biodiversity goes down pretty rapidly until you get to your open grasslands in a former tropical rainforest area, and there's really quite little biodiversity left. So it's one thing to recognize that this is indeed the case. So timber concessions are important, but how do you actually keep them as timber concessions? Because the problem is clearly that we're losing these timber concessions. They are the ones that disappear. And I wanted to highlight these books that we published in 2005 in a collaboration between myself, C4, the Center for International Forestry Research, WCS, and a number of other organizations. We really asked the question, what's going on here in these timber concessions, and what could you do from a research, a management, and a policy perspective to really make sure that these timber concessions remain viable? And I wanted to highlight this because there's a little side story to it. So we published the book in English first, and then it was translated into Indonesian. And I think there's an issue here that is of interest to a lot of conservation scientists, especially if you're employed by an academic institution, because the book on the left was one of my, it's actually one of my most cited publications. It's done really well. There's a lot of citations there. It's pretty well represented in the scientific literature. I don't know who reads it, I don't know what it's done. But I know that for the Indonesian translation, which is freely available as a PDF on the, I think, CIFO website and other websites, it's been downloaded some 150,000 times over the past 12 years. I know I've seen it in ministries' offices, I've seen them in NGOs, I've seen the books in timber concessions. There's really been wide take-up of this book as a practical guide to how you can manage timber concessions differently. Now, it's been a complete academic failure. I think it's been cited like 6 or 7 times over the past 12 years. And it's an interesting thing, actually, because I would say in terms of achieving conservation outcomes and changing practices, it's been super influential, but it's nowhere on ICB. And actually, if you're being judged or rewarded for academic performance, that's not the kind of book you want to write. So it puts conservation scientists in a different position sometimes. What do you actually want to do? Do you want to do good science and get published and get cited and help your career forward? Or do you want to achieve something? And those two are not easily compatible all the time. Little side issue, but I thought it was an interesting thought just to highlight. So the problem that we're dealing with in a place like Borneo is that we're losing timber concessions. That's the main thing. I just highlighted this for the Indonesian part of Borneo for the main reason that in Indonesia, for some reason, all data are always available. Even if the government says they're protected data, someone is always going to leak them. There's not a single data set that I can't get hold of. Malaysia, on the other hand, is, I don't know what they are, much smarter, much more secretive, but much better at guarding their data sources. And there's a whole bunch of data sources, even pretty basic data sources, that I simply cannot get hold of for the Malaysian part of Borneo. And I think even at the moment they've declared oil palm boundaries, concession boundaries, as state secrets, and the release of those concession boundaries, because lots of people have them, sends you to jail basically, as far as I understand it. So anyway, I've got the data for the Indonesian part of Borneo, and basically according to the Indonesian constitution, all forest lands belongs to the government. That's the forest state. And those forest lands can be either protected for protected area biodiversity, watershed protection, they can be laws for selective extraction of timber, or they can be converted to timber plantations, your fast-growing pulp and paper species. You cannot grow oil palm there. So the big changes that we're seeing between 1990 and 2014, those are data from the government. You have a slight increase in protected areas. At the same time, those protected areas are slowly losing their forests because the management isn't perfect. But the real big changes are in the non-protected part of this forest estate, where your forest area declines from about 365,000 square kilometers, which is half the island of Borneo, to about 245. So those areas are taken out of the forest estate and basically put into agriculture. And that's where we're losing the biodiversity in that process. Now, organizations like the Forest Stewardship Council are trying to work with that, trying to stabilize the use of forests, make it sustainable, make it financially sustainable. But as you can see at the moment, I think there's 12 concessions on 13,000 square kilometers, significant, but clearly not covering enough of that forest area to really stabilize the forest use. And pretty much every month I hear another, oh, that timber concession has gone out of business, that timber concession is given up. They're all going up the hills now, and timber prices are relatively low. They just can't make it work, and they're going out of business. And once they go out of business, it generally goes rapidly downhill. You get your illegal loggers to come in, there is no management, and then the government rapidly recognizes this forest is not producing anything, so let's take it out and plant monocultures. And that's the problem for biodiversity. That's what it looks like for Indonesian Borneo. The map on the left shows you in pink the areas that have been allocated to the oil palm, with a province like West Kalimantan on the western side of the island. Just eyeballing it, that looks like 60–70% to me potentially turning into oil palm. And the map on the right clarifies what has already been planted to oil palm, so that the areas in red are the ones that were in 2000 still forest estate, and in 2010 have been turned into oil palm. And that's where losses occurred. So for pulp and paper, I just pulled up some graphs here from different studies in pulp and paper concession. As I mentioned earlier, it needs about a drop of 50% in biodiversity in the bird species. Mammals are rapidly going down. Some species are doing reasonably well. It's not too bad, and I certainly wouldn't give up on pulp and paper plantations to at least try to achieve some sort of conservation objective, and it's beneficial for some species. For orangutans actually, and I know orangutans are this conservation icon that we love to establish as the solitary ape of the quiet primary rainforest. Actually, it's doing really well stripping bark and acacia plantation and feeding on cambium. And it's where we actually get things wrong. There is this kind of dream image about the orangutans. Orangutans are smart and ecologically pretty adaptable. They just can't stand being shot at. They're very slow breeders. That's what the biggest problem of orangutans are. Ecologically, they're not a particularly good indicator species. I'll talk a little bit later about oil palm as well. I wouldn't call an oil palm plantation an orangutan habitat. They're not going to survive there for very long, but they use oil palm plantations quite extensively. They actually feed on the oil palm food, they build nests in oil palm trees, and they use it to move from one forest area to another. So they're not your best ecological indicator species for the health of a particular forest area. Now some of these players, and in Indonesia it really is two players. It's, you probably heard these names, Asia Pulp and Paper, APP, and Acryl. They run, I don't know, about 95+% of the entire trade in pulp and paper in Indonesia. And I think after 20, 30 odd years of heavy pressure from NGOs, because of their very poor deforestation record, they've been pushed into increasing their level of performance in terms of conservation increasingly high. And they associate with a whole range of NGOs. Greenpeace worked closely with APP, WWF worked with the TNC, has just signed a contract with April, if I'm not mistaken. So they're starting to do that, and they're doing things on the ground. Several large set-asides in biosphere reserves. They're very active at the moment in closing peat drainage canals. The big issue about carbon losses because of peat decomposition is a massive one, especially sort of eastern Sumatra, the peatlands there. And they're very actively starting to restore hydrology in these peatlands. Big commitments. I think APP committed to 1 million hectares of reforestation or land restoration. A little bit of a question mark. I don't know how I feel about all this. It's good. It also feels a little too late because these companies clearly have played a major role in tropical deforestation in the past and have converted very large areas of national forest and turned them into plantations, either directly or through their suppliers. I think it's encouraging that they're starting to make these noises now and starting to set up different ways of going about land management, setting aside forest areas, and it will benefit a lot of species. I've done some work with APP looking at their tigers in plantation landscapes, and tigers are one of these species, again, if you provide them with shelter, water, and there's still prey around, and you take out the hunting factor, they will be fine. Whether the people in those plantations are fine might be a different question, but I mean, by and large, they will do okay. So I think there are some opportunities there. I'm not working closely with them at the moment, so I don't know exactly where this stands. I do a lot more with oil palm, and oil palm is always a bit of a funny one for me, and I know I annoy a lot of people when I write about oil palm because I'm always a bit positive about it. And again, I know I'm going to be the last one to deny that oil palms have massive impact on tropical deforestation, as I showed in my earlier maps. But there's something funny going on, and I highlighted that I've just published, or I've just submitted a piece to a newspaper, an international newspaper, that plays around with this thing between the coconut and the oil palm. They're both the palm trees. You seriously put the word coconut into your search engine, and everything that's beautiful about the world will come up. It's green, it's organic, it's healthy, it's beautiful, it's smallholder. It's just a wonderful, wonderful crop. Beautiful. You do the same with palm oil, and you get this completely split sort of picture of either the industry showing beautiful orange palm fruits and how wonderful it is in economic development and poverty alleviation, and the other side you get all the nasty stuff, the dead orangutans, the environmental campaigns, the fires, and it's just completely opposite sort of diametrically opposed sort of ideas about what oil palm is about. Now the reality of coconut and oil palm, there's less coconut in the world than oil palm. We're not talking about orders of magnitude. 12 million hectares of global planting, what we find in the FAO, and 20 million of oil palm planting. I mean, they're both large areas of palm plantations. And how does one end up with such an evil sort of image? And the other one is a good crop. There's something weird going on. And I think as conservation scientists, we need to be a little bit more on the ball to pick through that and say, okay, what is really going on? And how is it compared to other crops and so on? I mean, it is obvious that oil palm has had a very big negative impact, including on species like orangutans in general on biodiversity. It is not great for biodiversity. I mean, you get your bird species there, you get generally a pretty high abundance of rodents and snakes that feed on these rodents, some raptors and owls that are there, but by and large, it's not a great landscape for biodiversity. The crop here on the left, actually, I just pick up on that, shows the expansion rates in yield and production of different oil-producing crops. And Asia is actually not one of the fastest growing ones, it's Europe for some reason. So oil palm, I've done a fair bit bit of work, working closely with companies to try to work out what can we really do in terms of achieving conservation outcomes in the oil palm sector. And this is a company I've worked with for a few years now, PT in the Arsindo Agri group in Jakarta. They contacted me a couple of years ago and they said, we want the best oil palm concession in the world. That's what the owner wanted. Okay. Well, what do you want to do? They said, okay, we want to have large conservation set-asides, we want to have an ecological network within that area. So that sounds good. So I said, I can only help you to a certain extent. I'm very busy, I've got lots of other things to do. If I'm lucky, I'm going to spend 2 to 3 weeks a year in your concession trying to work with the people there. That's not going to make the change for you. I'll take the job if I can assign an environmental manager that you give a job within the company that puts him or her at the same level as any other senior manager. So the senior manager has a discussion about expanding planted areas because there is a planting target for the company, and that conflicts with the conservation targets. Then that manager needs to be able to say, no, you can't do that. They agreed. They allowed me to put in someone, a good friend of mine, Nardiono, and he's been totally behind the success of this particular company in terms of what it achieved in conservation. And I think it's almost worth a study in itself. He's a very Japanese guy, Japanese from the island of Java, which is it's a very gentle, friendly, formal type of people. And he's done this kind of weird thing of law enforcement with a smile. They had a massive problem in these areas. I mean, if you look at the map, which is interesting, normally if we publish a map as conservationists, you have the forest in green and then the bad stuff is red. They've also done the good stuff in green, but that's for them is the planted areas, and the red is the set-asides. But in those set-asides, massive problems of everything, like lots of snares, lots of hunting, lots of illegal logging, a real big struggle. And the company had bought those forest areas, had compensated the community, so that was all pretty much done. But then it's still a matter of enforcing it. And what my friend Nardiono did, he went in there every morning. They tried law enforcement, like strict law enforcement. They closed off the road because the logging trucks had to come out through the company to take the timber out. They tried closing it off, then the communities burned their guard posts down, so that didn't work. And he started going in there every day, and we counted some 75 independent illegal logging camps at some stage. He visited them all every day, saying, you're not supposed to be here, this is our forest, this forest is set aside for conservation, and we've compensated you for this. And somehow, I'm probably simplifying it a little bit here, but one by one, they went away. And for the past 2 years, there's not been a single illegal logging event in those forest areas. And I think it's an interesting little, I still don't understand how it works, because it's normally not how we see law enforcement happening. And I'm certainly not one that is always about softy, but I see in this case it worked, and I'd like to understand better what's the social dynamic behind it, what are the perceptions, the psychologies behind it. Why does it work sometimes, and why does it not work somewhere else? The point being that basically we have a stable situation here of some 150 orangutans in an oil palm concession. Now, I know there's people that have criticized this company, that there should have been more high conservation value forest set-asides. We could argue back and forth. There are problems there. There's actually a mining concession that's being given out right on top of the oil palm concession, and that road, that clearing between in the larger red area, that conservation set-aside, was basically a mining concession moved in, made a 50-meter wide road, and no one could do anything about it with support from local government. So there are issues. Some communities are not supportive of conservation set-asides. They reject conservation. They strictly want oil palm. So it's still like trying to move forward in this one. But I think by and large is an opportunity, or at least an example of where we really achieve or starting to achieve conservation outcomes in an oil palm context. And the context is much larger, and that's what we're trying to explore at the moment. The gap at the north side of the concession is a community forest, a Hutan Desa, a village forest. Further to the north is the beautiful Gunung Palung National Park. To the south there is a very large peat swamp area of about 35,000 hectares. And to the east is a number of other oil palm concessions that we're now starting to engage. And I sort of have a dream image for this larger landscape of everything connected, everything kind of stabilized, where everyone agrees, okay, this is going to be oil palm, this is going to be forest and remain forest, these are corridors, this is where we hunt, this is where we don't hunt. And then finally, I think you come to a situation where you can start managing. You have that kind of stability, where there's normally these kind of landscapes in Kalimantan, there's just too much going on, and there's too many threats, and you don't even know where to start. So stabilizing that all, I think, is a good start that provides you an opportunity to start achieving these conservation objectives. And the company there plays a key role as one of the financial facilitators, but also one of the facilitators in terms of the government recognizes that there is economic development there happening. It's providing employment. It's not all being locked up into conservation. I think that's important at the local level. Another example of a company I did some work in quite recently, actually, again, a good company under the Wilmar Group, the company PTMSM in central Kalimantan, set aside their conservation area, quite a large number of orangutans, other wildlife in there. Their problem was actually with communities that part of the communities just didn't want the forest protected. They rejected the protection of forest. They wanted oil palm, community oil palm in those areas. There was also issues there with land compensation, and we found out, I was digging around all these beautiful colonial era maps are online now and you can search them and so on, and I found this back from 1885, that the village was actually there. Of course these people have long-standing claims in that area, long-standing patterns of land use, of shifting cultivation and so on. So no wonder there's issues there about land compensation, and you just put an oil palm concession on top of that. That requires some very smart management. And I think this is one of these points where you start to realize that a lot of companies are not set up to do that kind of complex conservation management. I mean, I always like to say that we talk about something not being rocket science. If you see the number of rockets that actually make it into space and do whatever they're supposed to do, I think NASA has a 98% or 96% success rate. And in conservation science, it's so much more difficult than rocket science. I mean, really, it's as complex as it gets. Everything is involved: social issues, economic issues, natural history issues, everything is there in that complexity of conservation science. And companies are just not set up. I mean, they're very compartmentalized. They have a group, a division that does corporate social responsibility. They go to the community to talk about cows, the number of cows that will be given to the community, or assistance in building roads. So those very simple corporate social responsibility type of activities. Then there's another division that talks about labor. Communities work in stimulating oil palm concessions. So there's those discussions. And there's another division that talks about land compensation. And then there are the people that talk about conservation. And communities are utterly bewildered because every day is a different person with a different story. And those stories are not integrated in the company itself. And that leads to problems. And I think that's where we need to work with these companies to get them to understand what conservation contexts actually are and how do you manage for them. Well, government is not particularly helpful either. Until quite recently, it was actually illegal to protect forests in oil palm concessions. You have to do it under the Roundtable of Sustainable Palm Oil principles and criteria, but you cannot legally do that in Indonesia. Once it's been taken out of the forest estate and given out as an oil palm concession, you're supposed to develop oil palm. And if there's examples of companies actually setting aside forest areas within a local concession, and local government comes in, if you don't develop that, we'll take it away and give it to someone else who will develop it. So that's a real issue, that even though companies might want to do it, they're not legally or politically allowed to do so. Changes there, I mentioned the governor's decree in Central Kalimantan that for the first time says if you do have forests in your palm oil concession, you really have to protect that. Now, that's just a political decree that needs to be translated into much more detailed regulations, and it's going to take some time before we actually see change on the ground. But it's a positive sign that the changes are happening, that blanket approaches to oil palm planting are now being seen as not ideal. Not ideal for communities. The previous concession I mentioned, there were actually interesting struggles within the communities where the most powerful and the richest people in the communities, they were the ones with the land claims. They were the ones that potentially could make money from land compensation. They weren't that interested in the forest, but the poorer people in the communities were the ones that recognized that, I mean, they're basically subsistence fishermen. Those forests were important breeding grounds for the fish that they were catching. So even within those communities, they're not homogeneous. There's all sorts of power structures there as well. Just adding to that complexity. Now finally, mining and conservation. I think it's an interesting one because I sort of see, as I mentioned earlier, in the 1990s there was this strong focus on forestry being the great evil, and then the campaigners, environmental campaigners and NGOs sort of shifted towards pulp and paper, that became the great evil. Then there was a shift towards oil palm, and I think we're now heading into a phase where mining becomes more and more on the radar of these environmental and campaign groups. And it's an interesting one because I'm quite a fan of mining, good mining certainly, but I don't actually mind it because it has the potential to generate such vast revenues from such a small footprint compared to other land uses. I think the Indonesian government likes to promote their oil palm because it makes such a massive contribution to their economic development, but I think it's less than 2% of their GDP is generated through oil palm. The mining sector, which is really down and out, especially with low gold prices at the moment, generates 5%. So you have 2% here, 5% here. Now the ecological footprint of oil palm is 12 million hectares. The ecological footprint of mining is 250,000 hectares. So a much bigger contribution to royalties and taxes and so on to economic development for a much smaller footprint. The question, of course, is what do you do with that money? How is that money being spent? If you can arrange landscapes that are concentrated around mining, where the revenues from mining are being used to protect the ecosystem services and the forest around it, then it would be a good solution. But those frameworks don't exist. But I did want to point it out because we looked at the total deforestation associated with industrial scale mining in Kalimantan between 2000 and 2010. It's an unpublished study, but it really is quite minor. It's about 1% of total deforestation. And I worked quite closely with PhD Diligent to understand what is actually possible in terms of this vision I have of implementing landscape level management around on the basis of revenues from mining. BHP seemed a good choice. They've been there for a long time in the mining area in northern central Kalimantan, but after decades of trying and I think they just started to mine recently, they've been, I wouldn't say forced to sell their mine, but I know they made a very vast loss on their mine. Sold it to an Indonesian partner, and I think with that the chances of good biodiversity management are pretty much gone. I certainly like to try, but I think it's going to be different. And I wanted to highlight, they did a lot of standard stuff, like really good set aside hunting control and monitoring, and wildlife populations in the set asides were doing extremely well. But I wanted to highlight something different, that I started in a Timothy session where I worked in the late 1990s, where I recognized that, and this is generally for us altogether, I think, that we're really quite bad in using information. After 20 years, I still can't recognize a single species of tree. I can walk through the forest, I just don't see it. So we always focus on the things that we know about. I'm normally looking for birds or mammals, and everything else you see, a nice butterfly, I don't know what it is, I'm not noticing it, I'm not doing anything with the information. And I think especially if you're a student or you're a researcher, you focus on what you're supposed to do. If you're diligent, you may take notes. I saw a tough little ground squirrel in the forest. Are you going to use that information? It's not paper, you're not going to publish that. I spent a lot of time working with people like Andy Wilting, like trying to, Will Duckworth, like trying to compile information about additional species, and it's really quite appalling how little information there is. The information is there, it's just not there in an accessible manner. So what I picked up on, I was working in these Timothy sessions, and they had allocated teams that were responsible for wildlife conservation, patrolling, surveys, and so on. 5 people, pretty skilled. And they had another 2,000 people that had nothing to do with wildlife conservation. Your timber cruisers, your cooks, your guards, your truck drivers, and so on. And I started talking to some of these people, like some of the logging truck drivers. Oh, you want to see clouded leopards? Kilometer 38, every second night between 7 and 8 p.m. pretty good chance, always there. Oh, what do you think of this? Yeah, you have seen that. That turtle flies down from there to there. It's about from the tree. You realize these people sitting on a wealth of information that no one ever asks about, no one is ever interested in, and they're not going to volunteer that. So I train just generally sitting in front of large numbers of company staff to pick out who is interested and capable of identifying species, and we assigned tasks to them to develop, so that in their work, truck drivers or whatever, they would then also have a biodiversity task. Now, I had to walk away from the company, I don't know whether they maintained it, but we sort of, BHP took that up and really professionalized it. They completely institutionalized the system, the fauna and flora observation system, that basically anyone working in the company, whether you're the senior director from Melbourne or London, or you're the cook, or you're the guard, or you're even a contractor, a road worker, or a mining worker, everyone is responsible for providing data into the system. And the two powerful things I think come out of it is one, you generate information, and that information is publicly available. I think that's the least interesting one. It's a good one, and I mentioned here that there were several new records for the district, there was one new record for the province, that redneck foul road flew into the window of a guard post. Guard picked it up, took a photo, put it in the forum. He doesn't know what it is, but it goes into the system, and someone says, hey, that's a redneck foul road, never been seen in 20 months before. Information is there, that's picked up, can be used. I think much more importantly, it made everyone aware and interested in biodiversity. People said, you never asked us. That was not my work. Now I'm part of it. I started to see that I worked in this work for 30 years. I never paid attention. And now you ask me, yeah, I'm starting to look at snakes, I'm starting to look at birds. And it becomes something that everyone is involved in and interested in. And I think that is the much more important thing that probably, and these are just pilots we're trying, probably have a much bigger message, and I'm not sure yet how to implement it, how to use it, but there's so much, I guess, with what is it called, citizen science, I mean, people are starting to pick up on these techniques and these ideas, but there's actually simple ways, relatively simple ways of institutionalizing this within companies and really get everyone on board. I've tried this in the oil palm company I talked about earlier, and they stepped away from it. They said, no, we don't want to bother all our workers with looking at birds. They're supposed to pick oil palm. Well, I'm not going to see that many. I mean, it's like, no, but they didn't want to go in that direction. I'm still pushing, I'm seeing it, I'm getting in that direction. Now, another thing, big companies are big targets, and I wanted to highlight that because it sometimes annoys me a little bit. I work with big companies because they're generally the ones that are most exposed and the earliest to try to work and try to improve their practices. And I mean, of course, some of these practices, some of these companies have really bad records in terms of deforestation. It's probably fair to target them, but it's also sometimes dangerous. And I see this where companies tell me like, okay, so yeah, Peter called earlier, we get attacked. You haven't set aside all your HEB in your area, or you haven't well protected. Yeah, okay, that's true. Is the cup half full or half empty? I mean, how do you? And the risk is that they say, it doesn't matter what we do, whether we try or not, we just get hammered anyway. A company like APP for years, they got hammered irrespective of what they're trying to do. As I said, some is right, some is wrong, but you run the risk that companies just give up. What you're also missing is everyone below that, all the small names, the medium-sized and small-sized companies that no one ever pays attention to, that probably have a much bigger cumulative impact on conservation values than the individual small companies, but no one targets them. So no one is actually pushing them to increase the quality of their management. Now, some of that criticism is justified, as I mentioned. I'll skip over this for now. But it touches on another issue that I think is quite general, and I see this and I fight back, and I know I know people about it, but I think we need to think about this assumption that big is bad, like your big producers, your big oil palm companies, your big pulp and paper companies, your big mining companies, it's just evil business, capitalist business, and whatever. Fine, whatever. I said there are reasons to do so. But the flip side of the coin for many people is that small is good. And that's where I said, well, why? I mean, why does it matter to me whether like one company like cuts down 100,000 hectares of rainforest, or 100 small operators cut down 1,000 hectares of rainforest each? The end result is 100,000 hectares of rainforest that's gone. Where do we get this assumption that small is good and big is bad? And I see this a lot. I see this in science, I see this in NGO strategies, I see this in campaigning. And it's something we need to, I think, be a little bit more honest about what's really going on. And I know it's much easier. I do a lot of work on deforestation and oil palm. On a satellite image, I can easily determine an industrial scale plantation. It's much harder in that smallholder, heterogeneous stuff, much harder to tell apart. So there are technical issues, but just an example here. I mentioned earlier the total deforestation because of industrial scale mining over a 10-year period was 11,500 hectares in the whole of Kalimantan. I use a Canadian report, probably too small for you to see, but we'll get you the slides later, that looked at a study site in Kalimantan of 1.1 million hectares. So that's about, quickly thinking, 0.2% of the whole land area of Kalimantan, if I'm not mistaken. And they had twice as much deforestation because of small-scale mining. And you see the red areas in the map there. It can be really massive deforestation associated with that. This is a trip I made on the Runan River in central Kalimantan recently. That's community mining. Now, it's completely organized, it's completely funded by some boss somewhere in the city, some mafiosi. There's no impact assessment, environmental impact assessment, there's no regulation, there's no permits. But because it's small, it's good, it's allowed and condoned. And that's where I think we need to look a little bit more closely. What's happening in that small sector? What's really happening? What are the impacts there? And who benefits? Because as I mentioned earlier, the assumption that if a community does something, the whole community benefits, that's not generally how it works. I mean, some people in the community benefit most. The people in power, the people with the opportunity to invest in these kind of machineries to even get started, they will accumulate or gain 95% of the revenues. The workers there will get released. So there's also issues there of equity that we need to look into. What is really happening at these scales? But the kind of blanket approach to not being willing to differentiate between the big and the good side, I think is not particularly helpful in that respect. And it was shown by a study in Conservation Letters last year by Wood et al., where they looked at basically what they could recognize in terms of the impact of the four main industries on deforestation on the whole of Indonesia, where they could explain about 45% of deforestation. So 55% of deforestation is unexplained, at least not directly related to large industrial scale official type concessions that are active in that area in that 2000-2010 time frame. And it means there is lots of stuff happening: fires, smallholder agriculture, illegal logging, medium-sized companies, small companies, that whole sort of thing that no one looks at, but it's more than half of your problem. So I think we need to look more closely at what's happening there and really understand the dynamics of these problems much better. So I'm going to finish. I have no idea where I am with my time. I hope I'm not too far over, but I'm going to finish on a positive note. And as I mentioned earlier, we tend to think in terms of conservation, it's all doom and gloom. There's plenty to be said about in Borneo, species like orangutans, species like rhinos. There's a lot of species that are suffering and rapidly going down. At the same time, there's a lot of forest left. And as any country in the world that once had forests, Borneo is going through its forest transition, rapidly consuming its forest resources, and at some stage that's sort of slowing down, it's bottoming out, and then people realize that, well, having forests is quite useful, and that could be the Netherlands or Ireland, where they went to zero and then started replanting forests back to 15 or 20%, or it could be other countries where they recognize it much earlier and stabilize at a higher point. Now, I don't believe that Borneo is going to lose all its forests, because some of the forests are just pretty inaccessible. You could potentially take some trees out for natural timber harvesting, but no one's going to develop oil palm plantations in the mountains of Borneo at an extensive scale. Some silly people may try. I don't think it's ever going to be viable. So there's going to be forests left, and for me, the only meaningful question is, if it's going to stabilize, if it's going to bottom out the forest transition curve, what can we do in terms of our ability to influence public thinking, opinion, and policy to move that point forward? So it stabilizes earlier, what is left by then, and what do we do next when landscape starts to stabilize? And I think there's hope in places like Sabah, and there's plenty to be said about Sabah. There's still stuff happening there. There was a big discussion about a bridge to a wildlife reserve quite recently. But more or less things start to stabilize. People sort of agree, that's going to be forest, that's going to be oil palm, that's going to be protected, that's going to be logged. etc. So you start to stabilize land use, and once you start stabilizing that, then we can start managing. And I think that's, once we get to that point, we've gained a lot in terms of our ability to really start achieving conservation outcomes. So in conclusion, I don't think it's all greenwashing. I think there is a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of companies that don't care at all, that completely ignore any environmental or social responsibilities for that matter. But there are examples of companies that are really trying to do things differently. And I think it's important that we work with these companies. And also, I mean, as I said earlier, some of these companies just don't know how to do it. Let's accept that, and let's put the capacity there. Let's see if we can help them. We have the knowledge. I don't know how to grow well. I know nothing about it. But I know something about conservation complexity, and I can bring something to the table there that hopefully we can then constructively move forward into something that benefits both the company and the people that see conservation there. So it's important, I think, that all of us seek that kind of opportunities, those kind of opportunities, not just as research, but also in terms of translating your research into something that is meaningful to the company. One thing we described in the book, the Life After Logging book, there's a simple question out there that I've been asked many times for typical sessions. I have the choice of making a logging road. I can make it 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 meters wide. I prefer it as wide as possible, within limits, because it keeps my road nice and dry. It means lower maintenance costs for my roads. But what does it mean for species? And I just haven't found the answer. It's just not there. I don't think conservation scientists have given a clear answer to what do roads really mean in terms of fragmentation in forests in Borneo. The information isn't there yet. And that's where sometimes I think, as conservation scientists, we're not cued in enough about what questions really need to be answered. What questions, if we had the answers, could really help move this forward. So we need to be thinking more about the application. And maybe it goes back a little bit to many where many of us come from, this the academic side, academics requiring, I'm constantly battling with the science at UQ that just give them a simple question and they make this into a very sort of scientifically very interesting, but I just ask a very simple question. Yeah, but I want to make it complicated and scientifically innovative and cutting edge so I can get it in a big journal. And then I'm waiting for 3 years until the bloody paper is published. And I don't have 3 years. You give me the answer now. And that's that kind of tension, I think, that sometimes exists between the needs of conservation that requires answers, practical answers, and the needs of conservation science that quite often require certain academic achievements that take time and effort. And with that in mind, I think we should also cue into asking tomorrow's questions. Knowing that conservation science takes time, conceiving an idea, finding funding for it, finding the people that are going to do the research, doing the research, analyzing it, writing it up, dealing with endless reviews and re-reviews, and finally getting it published. Happily take you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Sometimes you just don't have that time, so you kind of need to think ahead. What is Borneo going to look like in 8 years? What are the questions that are going to be really relevant? Can we predict that? Can we sort of think ahead of time and start anticipating what is going to be most relevant and then contribute to that as conservation scientists and practitioners to start answering those questions? And I think on that note, I'll leave it. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope it's been some thought out there. I hope I haven't annoyed people too much for what I've been saying, but something out there that is going to be helpful in the rest of this conference. Thank you very much.